and Audacity in three, two, one. Hi, guys, and welcome back to the Barbell Lifestyle Podcast. And today we are introducing a very special guest who is going to be talking to us about body recomposition. And this is one of our favorite topics. And he is an expert in this area. So let's welcome Christopher Barakat. He is a scientist and is an adjacent professor at University of Tampa.
Yep. Yeah. Thank you guys so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for being here. So, go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience. I know I found you through another podcast and just listening to you talk about this topic there, but our audience might not be familiar with you. So go ahead and just give them the 411 on who you are.
For sure. So super briefly, essentially I got involved in the whole natural bodybuilding space back in 2011. And I was an undergrad student at the time. I thought I was going to pursue physical therapy for graduate school. So I was studying athletic training, which I felt like was the perfect foundational bachelor's degree for me that provided me with sports rehab, prehab, and emergency care. But then I just got deeper and deeper involved with bodybuilding, and I came across a exercise and nutrition science program that was basically studying everything related to muscle mass gains and fat loss. And I was like, I got to go there. I'm going to shift directions. And that's why I ended up going to the University of Tampa. So I got my master's there in exercise and nutritional sciences. And that's when I really began my involvement in the research field. I have a super great mentor over there. And post-graduation, they hired me on to teach part-time and stay in the lab and continue to research. So I do that part-time, but full-time I'm a coach. I also compete in natural bodybuilding still. And I work with primarily competitors, but I also do have some lifestyle clients. And we have a team of coaches at my brand. And I've been doing that full time since 2015 now. So that's a little bit about me in a nutshell.
That's awesome.
Super cool. And Chris, you're currently in prep right now, correct?
I am. Yeah. I'm 7.5 weeks out. Yeah, it's flying by. I started at 21 weeks out, and I'm just starting to feel it get difficult now. The first half has been super smooth, so I'm pretty excited. It's been a long time since hitting the stage back in 2017. So
oh wow, yeah, that's a long off season.
Yeah, super long.
Yeah, sometimes it's nice because then I bet you really felt ready at this point, right?
Yeah, honestly, it was important for me to shift my objective goals away from the physique, away from bodybuilding, and I'm very proud of what I've accomplished off the stage from 2017 to date. So I feel like if I put myself in more competition preps, I wouldn't have been able to dedicate the time needed to do things in the research field, do things with my business, and so on and so forth. So that's basically kind of where we're at. And I feel like I challenged myself intellectually over the past 4 years, but kind of missed that physical challenge. So put it up on the whiteboard to get it done this year and started attacking it.
Yeah, that's awesome.
I think it's super important for competitors to take time off away from the stage and focus on things that don't revolve around their physique. And because I think a lot of times competitors can kind of get their worth wrapped up on how they do on the stage. So I think it's really important to take that time off. And it's awesome that you're proud of those accomplishments.
Thanks. I appreciate it. Yeah, I think it's important. A lot of us talk about periodization when it comes to training or nutrition, but you kind of need to periodize your life too. So
absolutely
different goals, different seasons, different focuses, and create a 3-month plan, 6-month plan, 1-year plan, 3-year plan, 5-year plan, and try to get that done. I think that's a really good way to ensure you're maximizing what you do within those time periods.
Yeah, totally. So I know personally, I am in a 5 or so year off season myself. So the last time I competed was 2018, and the next year that I plan to start prep is 2023. So right now I'm kind of in that phase to kind of transition us into the topic here, where I'm trying to build as much muscle as possible. And while I would love to, lose a bunch of body fat while doing that, I know for me that probably isn't necessarily the case, but let's get into that hot question of, can you lose fat and build muscle at the same time? Because it's argued that you can, it's argued that you can't. I think the general consensus from the evidence-based community has now leaned towards specific populations definitely can, and otherwise sometimes you can. But let's get a little bit more into this, because obviously this is what you research. This is your bread and butter here. So could you give us some more insight into, I guess, the short and long answers to those questions?
Yeah, for sure. So, body recomposition or building muscle and losing fat at the same time has been something that you see a lot in terms of like a marketing scheme where it's like, hey, run this program, do this diet, and you'll build muscle and lose fat at the same time. And I feel like a lot of people in the evidence-based space or scientific community would just say like, that's BS. You either need to be in a calorie surplus or a calorie deficit, and you need to focus on one goal. And the truth of the matter is, I think a lot of people got caught up in trying to oversimplify really complex physiological processes just to make infographics or just to have these like really simple sound bites to throw at people. But when you look at the scientific literature, there's so much data in nearly every population that has demonstrated body recomposition outcomes over the past 30 years. So for sure, if you're a obese individual or a novice trainee, you are at the greatest, you have the greatest potential to recomp. Because if you're obese, you have a significant amount of fat to lose. And if you're untrained, you're so far away from your genetic potential in regards to muscle building that you just have a massive amount of progress to make there. And we know that novice trainees gain strength and size faster than an advanced lifter. So looking at the literature, again, the thing I focused on more so than anything was, does this happen in trained individuals? And the literature also demonstrates that. And that's exactly what my review paper was on in the Strength and Conditioning Journal. But then it gets a little bit nitty gritty because you need to define trained population. How is each research study defining trained population? And then another issue with the literature as a whole is they're constantly reporting group means.
Yeah.
So you're not looking at individual responses. So what I've seen in my lab since 2015, 2016 is every single semester, we have some individuals that recomp, some individuals that don't recomp at all, and some individuals that don't build any muscle and gain fat. So they'll all be on the same training protocol. They can be on a very similar diet. And there's massive individual responses that aren't being reported in these randomized control trials. So the fact that I just saw it over and over again every semester, it made me want to dive further into the literature. So, I mean, there's kind of a long backstory. I can briefly talk about it, but I'm more than happy to answer any questions. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, any backstory to just give us some more context on that would be awesome.
Yeah, for sure. So like one of the first randomized, I think it's important to also state that a lot of these research studies aren't investigating whether people can build muscle and lose fat at the same time. Like there's never been a randomized control study that the question was, can individuals build muscle and lose fat at the same time? It's usually like they're investigating a specific training intervention or they're investigating a specific nutritional protocol, and then they're just reporting the outcomes. So the first study I was ever a part of as a grad student, we looked at autoregulation of exercise selection versus fixed exercise selection. And it was an 8-week training study where these people came into the lab and did full body sessions 3 days per week. Long story short, about 5 out of the 17 subjects demonstrated body recomposition. So they gained muscle and lost fat. But when you looked at the group means, there wasn't a significant body recomp outcome for the entire groups. But that still caught my eye. And I was like, okay, why are these individuals responding so positively? And why are these individuals responding so negatively, even though they're doing the same training? And then the very following semester, we investigated our collegiate volleyball team at UT. And the recomp outcomes there were just absolutely tremendous. It was only a 7-week training intervention. They were working with an RD and sport nutritionist. And on average, these girls gained like 8 pounds of muscle while losing 6 pounds of fat or so in
Wow.
7 weeks. So I saw that. I was like, okay, again, we reported that in the results section, but like we didn't discuss it. And like, it was just like, it's kind of just like an outcome that we're sharing. And then a couple years later, I just kept seeing this. And then a couple years later, Jeff Nippert and I linked up to create that nutrition guide. That's the ultimate guide to body recomp. So I had to dive into the literature, not just from the studies in my lab, but the entire scientific literature. And I saw this being reported in so many studies, but again, it wasn't being discussed in the discussion section, or it wasn't really being highlighted or brought attention to. And then that following year, I wrote this review paper with my colleagues for the Strength and Conditioning Journal. So that's kind of the long story of how it all came together. And yeah, that's just like a quick synopsis, I guess.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting that you bring that up. And one thing that I picked up on here that'll kind of get us into, you know, what is causing that body recomposition versus not, is I know that there's a number of factors when it comes to just changing our body composition in general. As a coach, you know, we're trying to manage all of those variables and factors and keep them consistent, or as consistent as we can. And so I found it interesting that you mentioned, so that first study with the autoregulated training or not, it was just the same training program. You saw 5 people see recomp, and the rest of them didn't. And so immediately my mind jumped to, okay, well, genetics, stress, lifestyle factors, like training is just one of those factors. Then we jump over to that volleyball study where the results were even more profound. Nutrition was attended to. And so then there's that lifestyle factor. We're adding one more variable in that we've controlled. And I think this is kind of getting us to that conclusion of like, the more of these lifestyle factors that you do keep consistent, the more likely it is that you're going to be able to see that recomp response. Is that correct?
1,000%. Absolutely. So there's so many things that come into play. And because I got to know some of the individuals over, you know, a 10-week data collection process, I also knew what some of those confounding variables were for each individual.
Yeah.
So it's like a quick example. One subject was pledging for a frat. So he was getting like no sleep. He's doing all kinds of crazy stuff, probably drinking a ton of alcohol. And he made no gains, right? Like he barely made it through the study. But we can't control that. Like we're controlling their training. We're monitoring their diet in that study. And that was it. And then a couple other subjects that really didn't make much progress at all. They were like the highest trained individuals coming into the study. And they used to lift 5 days per week, and now they were forced to reduce their training to 3 days per week. So even though we were doing full body training sessions and they increased the frequency each muscle was being hit, let's just say they used to hit each muscle group one time to 2 times per week. Now they were touching each muscle group 3 times per week. Their weekly volume definitely went down, because I know these subjects in our study, they were doing in the beginning 9 sets per week per muscle group. And then to the end of the study, 12 sets per week per muscle group. But I know for sure some of these subjects were doing 9 to 12 sets per session per muscle group 2 times per week. So they were doing 18 to 24 sets per week before starting. But that doesn't, you know, like that's not being accounted for. And those are the people that didn't really make gains. So that's super important. And then, as you mentioned with the females, they made profound progress. And I think a big component to that was working one-on-one with that sports nutritionist and really crossing their T's and dotting their I's. And I would also say that their training status was also much lower. So when we look at scientific literature, if you see a study in collegiate athletes, a lot of people just label that as well-trained individuals. But to be honest with you, I don't consider them well-trained, right? Some of these girls are freshmen and sophomores, and they did a little bit of weightlifting with their high school strength and conditioning coach, if that, right? So like, they're not resistance trained at a high degree. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, they're freshmen and sophomores or even juniors and seniors, but how much like hypertrophy training have they really done with the barbell, you know? So of course they're going to respond pretty darn well in a short period of time. So all that needs to be taken into consideration, because a lot of the research, they labeled subjects as trained, even if they've only been lifting for 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years. So there's a huge discrepancy there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what I'm kind of seeing come to light here, which I really like, because I don't like to see things as very binary when it comes to looking at things in fitness or nutrition, is this spectrum of who can achieve body recomposition and to what degree. And so I'm kind of seeing here on one end of the spectrum, we have the people that we know can achieve this right out the gate, the obese population, the newbies, and people who are coming off a really long layoff from training are like the three populations that we know if they jump back into, a full nutrition plan, a full training plan, and start to manage their variables, they're going to see results, and they're going to see them with both fat loss and muscle gain. But then that other end of the spectrum is going to be the person who is a highly trained athlete, right? The collegiate volleyball player who's a senior. She's been doing strength and conditioning for 4 years now. And she's been working with that sports nutritionist the whole time. So for her and people kind of on that end of the spectrum, I guess my question to you is, this is where the argument really gets heated, right? Because we're like, can we achieve body recomposition at that point? And so thinking about myself, I'm 5, 6, 7 years into training. I've lost count at this point, but of tracking macros and training diligently for that long, I'm like, I would probably be really happy to achieve that, but ultimately I'm not expecting it. But I would love to hear your insight on that side of the spectrum.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the magnitude of recomp that you should expect should be much smaller. I would say it's still possible, especially if you manipulate a couple of variables or you provide a novel stimulus, or the way that you define recomp might be a little bit different. So another way to perceive it, or another kind of subcategory of recomp, is where you're gaining more lean body mass than you are fat mass. So your body fat percent is still going down, but you're not actually, quote unquote, burning fat mass.
Right.
But your body composition would improve, right? So especially with females, I know so many ladies come to me and my team and they're like, hey, I want to weigh 130 pounds. And they're currently 145, 150. I'm like, you'll probably be thrilled at how you look at 138 if you just gained, 5 to 8 pounds of lean mass. So don't get caught up on that random number that you have in your head. Because I promise you, like, building muscle is what attributes to looking more aesthetically pleasing. So yeah, the magnitude should be smaller. I would definitely expect it to be smaller. One other thing I'll mention is what I've seen with some subjects. We had one subject who was a collegiate basketball player for all 4 years. And then he entered our study after he was done playing collegiate basketball. So he did strength and conditioning for 4 years at the collegiate level. But he looked like a tall, lanky basketball player, super lean. He started off at like 8.2% body fat, just a lean, tall basketball player. When he did our study, this was the greatest responder that we've ever seen in our lab. He put on 20 pounds of lean body mass in 10 weeks.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So it was insane. And so it was a lower body training study. So we only reported the gains in the thigh. Like, we used the region of interest tool on the DEXA scan to only report gains of lean body mass in the thigh. So quads, hamstring, glutes, adductors, whatever. But when we looked at his total body, he gained 20 freaking pounds of lean mass. And we thought there was an issue with the DEXA. So we had him come in the next day just to like double check. But he basically, I don't know if you guys ever saw Phil Heath play college basketball.
I didn't.
Okay. So if you pull up a picture of Phil Heath in college, he like didn't touch a weight, but still looked like a natural bodybuilder.
Yeah.
And then the second this guy touches a weight, he just absolutely explodes. It was absolutely remarkable. But again, that person was trained. They were able to squat, 1.7 times their body weight to meet the criteria. They've been under a barbell. They knew how to squat. They knew how to bench press, but they've never done hypertrophy training. They've never done stuff focused on bodybuilding. So you take that individual that's been lifting for 4 to 6 years, but you provide them with a totally new training stimulus, and they still can recomp. And he actually lost fat mass too, which is just absurd. and and
Oh my gosh.
you go to talk about, genetics and the whole nine. And it's just, I think it's important to mention that, because I hate when people say that you can't, or this person can't. It's like, don't create the ceiling for someone else, because you don't know where their ceiling exists.
Yeah.
Like, they might be a remarkable athlete if they give it their all, and they've just never applied themselves in that manner. There's a really awesome natural bodybuilder that I'm friends with. He started his journey as like a New Year resolutionist. And, a lot of people sometimes point fingers at those people like, oh, the gym's packed in January, get the hell out of the gym. Like, I want my space back. But he didn't look like he would be, a phenomenal athlete to start. And then he's a natural pro bodybuilder and like someone at the top tier of the sport. So you don't really know what you're made of until you really apply yourself. And I don't like people going in there with really low expectations, because I feel like it totally decreases their motivation and makes the process less exciting. If I told my clients, hey, if you gain 1 pound of muscle this year, let's clap it up for you. Like, you did an amazing job. They're not going to want to work with me. Like, they're not going to want to hear that, especially if they're not, novice or intermediates. Like, if I've seen people gain 8 to 12 pounds of lean body mass in a 10-week period, why can't somebody gain 8 pounds of lean body mass in 6 months or in a year? You know what I'm saying? So I think it's important that people are motivated to train and they don't have the bar super low. I'd rather set the bar really high and miss it by a little bit than set the bar really low and reach that goal. So
I love what you said, basically talking about how important it is to have a good mindset going into whether you're dieting or trying to put on muscle or you're recomping, like whatever your goal is, having a good mindset. And I think what's really important too, when we talked about recomping, especially for our female clients, because we've all been in this position where we've been training, we've been doing their diet for maybe 8, 12 weeks, and they feel like they're not making any progress because the scale hasn't moved. And that's why Marissa and I, and I'm sure you too, we've stressed progress photos, because we're like, look, you can see that your body is changing and maybe you are losing fat, but you're gaining muscle. So while you don't feel like you're making progress, you actually are recomping, and that's huge. And so I love what you're talking about with females. It's like, well, I know that you want to lose 10 pounds, but you actually would look better if we put on 8. And so it's really, really hard, because women place such a big emphasis on the scale and the number that they see. So I love that. And for our female listeners right now, I mean, just really, really listen to this episode. And I'm just so excited for this.
Yeah,
for sure. Those are great points. And, progress photos are super important. Taking them in the same lighting, the same angle, so you can actually put a side-by-side up and see the difference, rather than, different lighting, different angle. And you're kind of like you're like looking at the photo, like, am I seeing something? But yeah, besides that too, circumference measurements are freaking huge. When I work with people, I basically never put someone in a theoretical caloric deficit right off the bat, even if their goal is fat loss, because I want to establish maintenance and I want to establish good habits, and then kind of work on the other components to their nutritional approach before putting them in a deficit. And what I see all the time is their waist circumference measurements comes down right away. Some of that can literally be like just improve the GI health, less bloating, less gastric distress. And then some of it's like true fat loss. And they really see that around the waist. So I do have people, take waist, shoulders, left arm, left leg, right leg, whatever, a little bit more in depth. But at the very least, if you want to at least see fat loss, taking a waist circumference measurement is super, super powerful.
Yeah, totally. And you're speaking right to the choir right here, because we do the same thing with our clients. It's the pictures, the measurements. And I want to go back to the points that you guys both made on scale weight, because I even like to take an even more zoomed out approach when it comes to looking at body recomp over a long span of time, because especially when you look at bodybuilding and how stage weights change for competitors year after year, I think that's a really good example of body recomposition over the long term. And no, they might not be keeping their calories at maintenance the entire time that they're doing that. But just going from, for me, it was 2016 stage weight was like 110 and I'm 5'6". Like that was ridiculous. And second year, 2018, the next time I competed, stage weight was about 124. And like just
probably better conditioning,
way better shape, way better muscle size. I think the conditioning was probably about the same, but like it was just absolutely insane how much of a change there was. And so like this time around, after 5 years of training, I'm like, I really hope that stage weight has gone up a good bit. And so that's one way to compartmentalize it. I also like to take my really long-term clients and show them as their weight that they kind of just sit at and like can live at goes up over time, how their body composition is actually improving from year to year to year, even though that like happy weight is kind of going up. So like personally, that used to be 130 for me. And now it's like 145 is like where I live. Right. And so people kind of just, I think, especially with females, we're just like hitting on this over and over again because it's so important. Like we have to readjust our expectations when it comes to wanting to look like we lift and wanting to look lean and toned. And however it is you describe it, actually, we need to flip the script from I want to lose weight to I want to gain muscle. And that's going to mean changing the scale in the opposite direction than you probably think.
100%. If I can add something for the female listeners.
Please.
Yeah, I think it's really powerful. Again, I mentioned it briefly. So if you set someone up at caloric maintenance, whatever that theoretical maintenance is, you're actually giving them a better opportunity to build muscle than if they were in a deficit. So yes, they can still recomp while being in a deficit, and they can build muscle and lose fat while being in that deficit, and they will lose more body fat, but they can gain more muscle at maintenance than they probably would in a deficit. More importantly, their ability to sustain and adhere to their diet is way higher when they're not in a deficit because hunger and satiety is not an issue. Actually, when I have people eat at maintenance with like nutrient dense whole foods and a high protein approach, they're actually like, I'm full. Like it's actually hard for me to eat this much. And I'm like, that's great. At least, you're not gaining weight. You're just like maintaining weight, but your body composition is slowly improving. So let's keep doing this. Like hunger is not an issue. Your energy in the gym is fantastic. Your recovery is great. So let's ride this wave rather than, put you in a 300 calorie deficit or a 500 calorie deficit. And then you're hungry all the time. You're moody. Your energy to do work task goes down. Your performance in the gym might take a hit. Your recovery is not as good. So let's just ride this maintenance thing and let's focus on some objective goals in the gym where it's like, okay, you're doing this specific movement for legs. Like this is your favorite compound for legs. Let's get really strong at this lift. You're doing this movement for shoulders. Let's get really strong at this lift. You're doing this movement for back. Let's make progress on this lift. And let's focus on those objective numbers rather than your scale weight. And just let's ride out this maintenance thing for a minute now.
Yeah. I mean, same thing happens. Like I have clients who are just, I can't eat this much. Like, what are you having me do here? And it's like, well, you're, force feeding yourself a little bit at some points, but like you're literally making amazing progress. And sometimes I even see scale weights slowly trend down over time when I put them at like a theoretical maintenance, and then they're just not quite hitting it because they can't get to that place yet with their appetite. Sure. And like they're able to see those results, but they're just blown away by the fact that they're eating so much. And so, yeah, I think we have very similar, like all three of us, very similar coaching methods when it comes to really taking our time before just throwing someone into a deficit, especially because on most of my consultation calls, I'm just hearing about all of these stories from people where like they've just done this dieting thing over and over again. And they get into a deficit, they hate it, they make it all the way through, and then they just put that weight right back on. And so they're just going through a cycle of yo-yoing instead of actually being able to learn how to live and strength train and have a healthy lifestyle. And so teaching someone how to just live healthily at the beginning is something that I don't think enough coaches do. So I'm really happy that we kind of resonate on that note.
100%.
Yeah. And I think a lot of females too, is even if they're coming to us and let's say they're eating 1,800 calories, a lot of times we have to restructure the percentages of their macros. And so I think it's really important to not jump into a deficit, because we want to make sure that they're eating at their like more optimal numbers. And so for a lot of our female clients, just a simple increase in protein can make a huge difference in the results that they see. And I think that's the other thing, Chris and Marissa, that you guys were talking about. They're like, I can't eat this much. Yeah. Like, yeah, because you went from eating 50, 60 grams of protein to now 120, maybe even 140. And that's a huge difference.
For sure.
Yeah. So when we're talking recomp, you mentioned crossing T's and dotting I's and taking care of those things for maybe our more advanced people or people who want to see that recomp happen, but don't necessarily know how. I have a couple of things in mind that I'm pretty sure you're going to mention, but what are those T's and I's that we need to be taking care of when it comes to those higher levels for body recomp?
Yeah. So one thing is a higher protein intake. I do think that's more optimal for recomposition, especially when you're in a surplus, actually. So what I see a lot of people do is they either keep protein the same year round, or they lower protein when a subject gets into a surplus and they really start driving the carbohydrates up, just because they know that you're in a safer place where you're not going to lose lean body mass because you have a surplus of energy coming in. But the issue that I have with that is, as your carbs and fats go up and your calories go up, your trace proteins go up. So then your complete proteins, your essential amino acids actually go down. And that's what's building muscle tissue. That's what's leading to muscle protein synthetic responses. So just because you're at 1 gram per pound while you're at maintenance or you're in a deficit, that doesn't mean it's actually ideal if you're in a surplus. So I actually drive protein intake up while someone is going into their surplus phases and they're in their gaining phases. I think that's really important. And then focusing on things like nutrient timing. So making sure you're doing everything pre and post workout to ensure you're having the best performance possible in the gym and the best recovery post workout. So we can talk about some of those things in a little bit more detail too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm a big fan of the pre and post workout nutrition, favorite meals of the day personally. Yeah. So yeah, we could go into that one first if you want.
Yeah, sure. So in regards to a pre-workout meal, context is everything. So it depends on what kind of training you're doing, how long your training session is going to be, the intensity you're lifting at, and also whether or not you're in a surplus or a deficit at the moment. So for those that are dieting and they are in a fat loss phase or they are in a calorie deficit, it's more important to focus on pre-workout nutrition here compared to somebody who's in a surplus. They have, full muscle glycogen, they have full liver glycogen, and they have higher body fat levels as energy reserves. So however, the concepts stay the same. So for pre-workout, I generally recommend consuming around 1 gram per kilogram of carbohydrate. So if you're a 60 kilo female, you would have approximately 60 grams of carbs in that pre-workout meal. And I like having 2 carbohydrate sources, multiple transportable carbs. So I like having a starchy carbohydrate that's going to break down into glucose, and then a fruit source where a percentage of that is going to break down into fructose. A lot of the research on this is actually in endurance performance, not in weightlifting, but you can take some of those constructs and apply it. The main thought process there is that we have different transport proteins that transport carbohydrates for utilization differently. So let's just say we ate 60 grams of carbs and it was only from 1 carb source. You could think of it as 60 people being in 1 room and the fire alarm going off and they need to exit through 1 door. They only have 1 means of getting out of that room. Whereas let's say you had 40 grams from a starchy source and 20 grams from a fruit source, you still have 60 people in that same size room, but now there's 2 doors of exit. So 40 people can go one way, 20 people can go the other. It makes the digestion and the utilization a little bit more efficient. and it provides you with more sustainable energy. So usually your blood glucose levels are going to be more stable rather than kind of peaking rapidly and crashing rapidly. The last thing you want while you're training is to go hypoglycemic. And that happens a lot if people are making poor food choices beforehand. And that's kind of when you're like 1/3 or midway into your workout and you just feel like you crashed, feel like your blood sugar is going low. So for pre-workout, I generally recommend like lower glycemic carbs and again, mixing them. And then you want a sufficient amount of protein to, again, maximize that protein synthetic response and minimize the possibility of tapping into your lean body mass for energy, right? Make sure that you're more in an anabolic environment rather than a catabolic environment while you are doing something that is catabolic in nature, like you're breaking down muscle tissue while you're training. So setting yourself up really well with your pre-workout nutrition is just a great way to ensure you have solid performance and solid energy. And we know that your performance is what is leading to the training adaptation. So if you're not performing well, you're not going to create that signal and response to build more muscle. So pre-workout nutrition can be really, really important, especially over the long haul.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And then for post-workout nutrition, what are your general recommendations there?
And then post-workout's kind of similar. However, I do personally recommend high glycemic carbs. A lot of people still consider that bro, or maybe they think too much of a fine detail to pay attention to, but I still do it. So I utilize high glycemic carbs, and that range is a little larger. Rather than 1 gram of carb per kilogram of body weight, I go from 1 gram up to 1.5 grams. And then I still utilize multiple transportable carbs. So for me, oftentimes it's something really easy to digest, like a crisp rice cereal, like a rice cake or a rice cereal or a Rice Krispie, something like that, with a little bit of fruit, and then a whey protein isolate. We know that those amino acids are going to be digested and utilized extremely quickly, and you're going to start that recovery response super, super quick. So that's generally post-workout nutrition. Also, pre and post pre-workout, you want to make sure you're really well hydrated. That's almost more important than the food alone. Like hydration status is really important. And a lot of people in our society today are like chronically dehydrated. So making sure that their fluid intake is where it needs to be is going to make a massive difference in performance. And then post-workout, you want to make sure you're getting those electrolytes back in. So making sure you're salting your food and making sure that you're rehydrating appropriately as well. But that's kind of it in a nutshell. I mean, there's so much to talk about, but that's like a good synopsis.
Yeah, no, that's great. And you're right about the chronic dehydration. It literally blows my mind when I set someone say a water goal of like half a gallon per day to start. Because usually I'm not going to just throw a gallon on someone out the gate. Because I'm like making the assumption at this point that most people are drinking like 2 cups of water a day, if that. And it's like, it's crazy how much like clients will struggle to hit a half a gallon at first. And then, of course the body adapts, but it's just, it blows my mind. Are you hydrating? Yeah, I drink a diet soda and 3 coffees. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Got it. Cool.
Yeah, exactly. Caffeine is like the number one drug, and that just increases diuresis and like is further dehydrating people, but that's what everyone's sipping on. So
yeah,
it's crazy.
So I did want to go into, so we kind of touched on, all right, what do we do with our pre and post workout nutrition? I want to touch on a little bit of that higher protein intake and just where we're at for that. Sure. But also, okay, we have these people that want to cross their T's, dot their I's and see body recomposition, but I'm sure there are populations that will also want to explore that maybe shouldn't, or maybe it's just not the best idea to go for body recomp versus a cut or a surplus. And so I do want to get into that. Let's talk protein intake. So you said 1 gram per pound might not be enough because we might not be getting complete protein sources. I 100% agree. You made me think of a client that I have, and she's a competitor actually. And in her off season, her numbers get absolutely insane. She's eating upwards of 90 grams of fat per day, 450 something grams of carbs. And so she's also a vegetarian. So it's hard for it. And when she's cutting, it's hard for her to get in her protein sources. But at this point, I'm like, we're definitely raising up that protein intake because we're going to get way more complete sources in if I raise your protein compared to just keeping it at her body weight, which is literally 130 pounds.
Wow.
And she's eating that much. So like she blows my mind, absolutely blows
Yeah.
my mind. But that's like the example that you made me think of right away, because we want to maybe just get it above body weight. But where would you recommend there?
For sure. So I like using a sliding scale. By the way, is this just audio or video too?
We do post the video on YouTube, but we do have a majority of our listeners on audio.
Okay, cool. So you can think of this as a sliding scale, guys. I like using not only body weight, I actually like using lean body mass a little bit more. And a lot of people are like, well, I don't know exactly how much lean body mass I have because I don't know my exact body fat percent. You don't need to know it. You should know if you're close to 15%, 20%, 25%, especially for females. Are you 40% body fat, 35%, 30%, 25%? You should be able to guesstimate, whether like, oh, I'm 27.5 or I'm 23, it doesn't matter. Guesstimate what your lean body mass is. And then I like using a range between 1.2 grams of protein per pound of lean body mass up to 1.6 grams of protein per pound of lean body mass. And that sliding scale works based on your starting body composition. So for people that have higher body fat percentages, they can have lower protein intakes closer to the 1.2. And then for those very lean individuals that have very little body fat, they can be closer to the 1.6 grams per pound of lean body mass. So one reason why I don't like the whole 1 gram per pound or 0.8 grams per pound, especially when you're working with Gen Pop, you can have clients that are 45% body fat, 50%, whatever it may be. So I'm not going to have a 200-pound female on 200 grams of protein. It's absolutely ridiculous, especially when they're eating 65 grams per day before starting working with a coach, right? So you kind of guesstimate what their lean body mass is, and you set them up closer to that 1.2 because they have so much body fat, which is an energy reserve that they can tap into for fuel. And the likelihood of them losing any muscle is like non-existent because they're also probably not well trained. So now you're throwing in this training stimulus, which is novel to them. They are going to build muscle and lose fat. So that's the sliding scale that I like to use. Again, utilizing lean body mass instead of just total body weight.
Right. And as they get leaner, they can slide up that scale. Right. And so I love that. I think one thing that I do that might be different, might be similar, is basically when clients come on and like you said, they're eating 50, 60, sometimes even less grams of protein per day. Sometimes I just say, let's try to get 100 grams per day. And let's just start with that. Like, I don't care what the math is yet. I just want to get you eating a little bit more consistently and then kind of gradually grade them up to where they ideally should be. And I think that this like brings into the conversation just the aspect of behavior, because like ultimately when we're coaching people, we're changing people's lives and behaviors and habits, and those things affect multiple other things that they do in their day, not just their nutrition. Right. And so I think it's important that if you're listening to this and you're thinking like, I want to make these changes and it just sounds like a lot to just start doing, I would really just give yourself some grace here and just try to make a small change at first. Like if you're eating 30 grams of protein per day, first of all, quantify it, figure that out, how much you're actually eating, and then just take small steps up. It's okay if you go from 30 to 50 grams at first, then 50 to 70, and slowly get yourself up over the course of a couple of weeks if you're going to actually be able to do it, versus trying to force feed yourself an amount that seems ridiculous and just feeling like a failure after a couple of days of not hitting that target, right?
100%. Yeah, that's a great point. So like a quick suggestion, let's just say somebody eats 50 to 60 grams per day to start. What we typically see in our modern society is breakfast and lunch is usually pretty low protein. It can be like a carb and a fat, and then maybe for lunch too, kind of like a carb and a fat based meal. So let's say they get 10 grams of trace protein for lunch, 10 grams of trace protein for breakfast. they're at 20 grams for the day. And then for dinner, they have 30 to 40 grams because they ate, you know, a chicken breast or a piece of fish or a steak, whatever it may be. So something that's like a simple baby step that you can take to say, okay, I clearly only kind of eat like an actual protein source one time per day, which is usually dinner. I'm going to try to do that twice per day. So now you do it lunch and dinner, you do it breakfast and dinner. And then eventually you do that 3 times per day. So now you're at 90 grams of protein instead of 60. And then eventually you get to like 110, 120. And you're like, oh, this makes sense. And now I can just throw in a 25-gram protein shake as a snack. And now I'm at 135. And you slowly but surely kind of walk it up and introduce like a new behavior, like one step at a time.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, great points.
Cool. So let's get into when it might not be appropriate to pursue body recomposition, because we're obviously, the people here talking, we're all advanced athletes, bodybuilders, and it might be, you know, more, I guess, strain than it's worth for some people at our level to actively pursue body recomposition at a maintenance level for calories versus going one way or the other when it comes to cutting or bulking, which is kind of where that argument stems from, right? Is should you cut or should you bulk? Or, oh, you can do both. No, you can't. And so what do you think for that?
Yeah, I think if you are a super well-trained athlete, you know, physique competitor, power lifter, if your main goal is to gain strength and build muscle, and like you're already acquired a lot of your muscle tissue and you're kind of close to your genetic potential, just get in that calorie surplus and focus on your training performance, your recovery, and therefore, you know, your strength and muscle hypertrophy outcomes. Still, you know, practice and apply these solid nutrient timing strategies, but you shouldn't have two goals of building muscle and losing fat. If you are in a off-season improvement season and your goal is like, hey, I need to get bigger or I need to get stronger, or a combination of the two, just focus on one of them. I will say, whenever you're cutting, like regardless of what phase you're in, I think it's a cool mental perspective to have, is like, all right, I'm going to try to recomp even if I'm advanced, because at the very least, it's like, okay, I'm going to do my absolute best to retain all of my muscle.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to lose muscle. And I'll just give like a super quick example. I am prepping now, as you mentioned in the beginning, and I'm like doing a case study on my contest prep. So when I was 21 weeks out before I started the diet, I did a DEXA scan, and I also took ultrasound measurements of my muscle thickness, which is like a direct measurement of certain muscle groups, whereas the DEXA scan is looking at total lean body mass. It's not looking at actual skeletal muscle mass alone, right? So there's other tissues and other components that make that up. So over the course of 11 weeks, I lost 1.5 pounds of lean body mass on the DEXA scan. But when I looked at my ultrasound measurements, I maintained 100% of my pec thickness, 100% of my quad thickness, and I actually gained 5% on my bicep thickness. So like my biceps have actually grown even though I've been in a deficit, and even though I'm pretty advanced. And I actually wasn't surprised about that, because the way I approach my arm training in my off season is super low volume because it's a stronger body part. And now that I'm contest prepping, I'm taking my arm training just a tad more seriously than I would in my off season. So I wasn't surprised to see that, but it's important to note that like all lean body mass isn't just muscle mass. So why did I lose 1.5 pounds of lean body mass? It could literally be because my liver is slightly smaller, because I'm, 15 pounds down. It could be my small and large intestine and stomach is slightly smaller. It can be just because my blood volume has gone down. So other tissues can have decreased in size, whereas it's not actual muscle tissue. So just something to take into consideration. But if you are advanced, focus on gaining strength and building muscle, and just eat in a surplus to ensure you're maximizing your recovery. Don't focus on recomp. But whenever you get into a fat loss phase or a mini cut or a period of maintenance, even like, hey, I just want to eat at caloric maintenance, kind of give my digestive system a little bit of a break of this surplus, because you might be feeling like you're force feeding. at that phase too. Okay, I kind of want to stay at this body weight, but I want to see the look improve slowly but surely.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think that's super important. And we've talked about this in previous episodes, because I think that sometimes we can fall into the trap of, I either have to be bulking or I have to be dieting, that it's one or the two. And so I think that sometimes when people are in that maintenance phase, they can kind of just think like, well, I'm not changing, I'm not growing, I'm not adapting. And so I think it is important, again, when we talk about that mindset, it's like you can continue to evolve and you can continue to make improvements. And maybe it's not on a larger scale, but over time, you can still make those positive changes to your physique.
Yeah, I agree. I think something that's important to realize too, like if you're at maintenance and you're a high level intermediate or advanced trainee and you're performing the same exercises, you're not performing a novel exercise. If you're getting stronger on that lift, it's likely due to gains in muscle size, not neuromuscular adaptations. You're probably not becoming significantly more efficient or skilled in a movement pattern that you've already been doing for 6 years. You know, that late into your career, like you can probably attribute some of your gains to actually gaining muscle, even if your scale weight didn't go up or you're eating at maintenance. So I think that's important to take into account. Whereas like if you're a beginner, your strength is going to skyrocket just because you're improving that skill of performing this movement pattern. Your neuromuscular activity improves. So it's kind of a combination of the two. Whereas when you're super advanced, I would say a larger percent of strength gain is due to size and not neuromuscular adaptation. The only time that doesn't hold true is if you're introducing a brand new movement. So like, okay, I've never done this particular shoulder press machine before. On week 1, I'm only working with 45 pounds. And now on week 4, I'm already working with 70 pounds. So I made a massive jump in terms of percentage of strength. That's not going to be because, oh, my shoulders freaking blew up and got jacked. It's like, I'm learning this machine, I'm learning this movement. So you definitely take that into account.
Yeah, that's always my favorite part of a training program is the first week to the second week where I like, okay, I'm learning with the flow of this new program. And then week 2, oh, I know I can just slap some more weight on this. Like I just know, because like I know my body's going to be much more adapted, especially the first week after a new training plan when you're like wrecked from soreness for the whole week. And like you're just like, I don't think I can push to my full capacity this week. But by week 2, week 3, you're adapted. Yeah. And then by like week 6, 7, 8, I'm just like, I'm squeezing out maybe one more rep. And that's what we're getting today. Yeah. But yeah, I love what you said too about the mindset of when you're cutting and when you're dieting, and, you know, just having the mindset of, okay, maybe I can recomp here, and just keeping that at the forefront of your mind. And that's something that I really have tried to do when dieting in the past, because just, I call it fighting the deficit, because ultimately if you give into that and you say, well, I'm eating less, therefore my performance is going to suck, then you're just going to have a higher chance of losing muscle. And so ultimately, if we are trying to retain everything that we can, and with the possibility there that we can gain muscle in that time frame, I think it's always worth just giving it that extra push.
Totally agree. Totally agree. One thing I will say, yeah, if you go into that with the mindset of like, I'm expecting to lose strength or I'm expecting to lose muscle, you are. Like, there's no way you're not. You already are defeated up top in the mind. One thing I will say, if you are cutting and you're a physique athlete, I think it's really important that you're smart and strategic with your exercise selection, and you're not utilizing certain movements that are overly fatiguing from a systemic standpoint, and don't necessarily provide you with the best stimulus to fatigue ratio when you're looking at like a target muscle, especially as a physique athlete. Because this, like right now, this year, I feel like I'm maintaining my strength really well. And I think a large component is the exercise selection I'm utilizing, as well as taking a very, very, very high intensity approach, but a very low volume approach. So I just give it my all for 2 working sets and I'm done. rather than, looking at a spreadsheet saying like, oh, I got to do 3 or 4 working sets. And just like the thought of that to me right now would be like, I can't give it a 10 out of 10 effort on every set because I'll just be done. I think in the past, my volume was so high that my muscle protein breakdown outweighed my muscle protein synthesis. So I think this year my stage weight is going to be at least 3 to 4 pounds heavier. And I think a large part of that isn't all due to gaining muscle in the off season, but I think a large component is going to, again, this is I guess hopeful speaking right now, putting it out there into the universe. But I think a large component is just dieting a little bit smarter, and more importantly, training smarter. So reducing my training volume where I'm stimulating the muscle, but I'm not absolutely annihilating it with like too much volume that I'm digging a bigger ditch than I can kind of refill.
Yeah. And I think that's actually really interesting because when we talk about training, depending on the season, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think it makes sense for the context that we're in, is when people talk about should your training change when you are cutting versus bulking versus maintaining or whatever. Mm-hmm. And I feel like everyone who's #science jumps to no, it shouldn't change. Like it should be the same. Like theoretically, yeah, like train hard. You're going to put your effort in there and you're going to be doing, varieties of rep ranges and exercises and all that. But I think the point you made about lowering volume to diet smarter, mm-hmm. and just like being realistic about where you can put your effort, because I've been on programs and contest prep where it's like, oh, we're doing German volume today. Fuck, like, or like, oh, we're doing 6 sets of 15. I want to die. Like, and obviously like the mental load when you're dieting of that is going to be greater than if you're able to push that volume in a surplus. So I've heard that a number of times now of reducing volume in a cutting phase just by a set or two, and how much of an amazing difference that can make. So definitely taking note of that for the next time I cut, because I think that's becoming more and more mainstream now with our evidence-based community.
Yeah, I agree. I think, again, if we are in a cut and our primary goal, like if we're super advanced, is like, hey, I want to retain every ounce of tissue possible. We know in the scientific literature that when people are eating at maintenance or a surplus, they can maintain their lean body mass with like 1/7 of the volume.
Yeah.
Right. And that's on, a shorter time period. These studies are shorter time courses than a contest prep. And these people are not contest lean. So they're not in a position to, they're not in a position where losing muscle is at a higher risk. But the fact that people are maintaining lean body mass with like 1/7 of the volume, it's like, why would we try to do more if we know we can't recover from more? Like we have less fuel coming in, why do more?
Yeah.
Like, okay, my goal right now is maintaining my strength so that mechanical tension stimulus is the same. So it's the same when I was 183 pounds as it is right now at 167 pounds, because I haven't lost strength. That mechanical tension's still there. Whereas if I did too much volume and I did lose strength, I'm now training with less mechanical tension, or the magnitude of the stimulus is slightly lower, even though I'm doing more quantity of that stimulus. It's not as strong of a signal, essentially.
Right. And just really quality over quantity, right?
100%.
Yeah. So one of the things that made me think of was, I feel like maybe back in 2016, in 2016, the big thing in the bodybuilding community was like HIIT style cardio sessions. And then I feel like there was a shift and we kind of all moved away from that. And we were like, well, we can't really recover from those sessions, so we should do low intensity. And so everyone was like, oh, HIIT's bad, we should only do low intensity. And so, Chris, I was looking at your Instagram earlier and I noticed that you had been doing some cardio sessions specifically for cardiovascular health. So do you feel like your view or perspective on cardio has changed throughout the years, and what are you currently doing now?
Yeah, 100%. I see a lot of people, again, it's funny to see the pendulum swing. So like
Oh yeah.
I mentioned, 6 years ago, 8 years ago, 10 years ago, HIIT is superior for fat loss than LISS. And now it's like HIIT is way too intense. You're going to be under recovered. Just do LISS, or don't even do LISS. Just track your steps because cardio is bad. So again, you see black and white statements, just run away because it's missing context. When you look at the scientific literature, HIIT is not superior for fat loss, but it's undeniably more time efficient for fat loss. So if you can burn 300 calories in, 10 to 15 minutes of HIIT compared to being on a treadmill for 45 minutes, that's something you may need to discuss with your client. Like, hey, you're working, a 10-hour job, you have kids to take care of. I'm not going to tell you to go on the treadmill for 45 minutes if you really don't have those 45 minutes. I might tell you, okay, let's bang out 10 to 12 minutes of HIIT. And I think you need to be smart with what high intensity exercise you're prescribing. I'm not going to do sled pushes. I'm not going to do, incline sprints. I'm going to do something that's like a concentric stimulus only to ensure I'm not breaking down a ton of muscle tissue. So doing something like a bicycle or doing something like an elliptical is a much safer and smarter option where you can get your heart rate super, super high. You can get that cardiovascular stimulus you're looking for, but you're not going to be sore the next day. It's not the hardest thing on your central nervous system. So just be smart with how you program it. And you can utilize both tools, and then you see people that don't want to do any cardio at all, and they just want to eat less food and they want to do more steps. And I'm like, that might not be the best idea either, because if you're eating less food, you're not only providing yourself with less macronutrients, but also less micronutrients. And those micronutrients are important for things related to metabolic health and hormonal health and so on and so forth. So you just need to use every tool in the toolbox when needed. You can't look at everything as a nail and the only tool you have is a hammer. So just understand what tools you have at play and apply them appropriately.
Totally. I love that. I wanted to touch on one more thing when it comes to when it's might not be appropriate for pursuing body recomposition. And that's with the majority of the people that I work with. And I think the message that I really portray is sustainability in terms of mental, physical, and life balance when it comes to our nutrition and our training. So a lot of the people that I work with aren't necessarily looking to take it to the next level or be a competitor. And that's the majority of my population is Gen Pop. And so when I say, hey, let's track some macros for a bit, I get a nervous response at first, right? It's not like, oh yeah, I'm data oriented. Like I want to take care of all my variables. It's more so like, oh God, I had a bad experience with this before. I don't want to do this. How long do we have to do this? Right. And so a lot of times it's about using tracking as needed to get the information that we need, and then finding sustainability after the fact. I, of course, have the clients who are like, oh no, this is for me. Like, I want to be meticulous. I want to cross those T's, dot those I's. But I think if you're getting to that point where you have been doing this for a couple of years and you're tired of tracking, or you're tired of being that meticulous or having to pay attention to all those details, and that's not what you want out of your journey, I think that there's a place that we need to come to for that type of person where body recomposition cannot be the expected outcome if we want to let go of meticulousness. Because when we do get to that level, body recomposition requires it. And we have to pay more attention. We have to do more detail-oriented work in order to see those outcomes happen. And I think the bodybuilding community is a special community that has a lot of people that do that. But at the same time, that's not everybody, right? So like a lot of our audience is Gen Pop. So talking to them, if you are a couple years into your strength training journey, you know that you're pretty well off with this. And you know that, recomposition is probably going to take those extra 5-6 steps of effort for you. You have to weigh the pros and cons of how is that going to affect your life, your mental health, and the balance that you have there too.
Yeah, 100%. So I think, like kind of mentioned in the beginning, you have obese individuals, you have novice trainees, people that don't have much experience at all. Then you have detrained people, detrained population. So they might have been really jacked at one point, but they took a couple months off or a couple of years off. All of those people can definitely recomp quick. And then the more trained you get, the harder it gets. There is that subcategory of like the sub-optimized trainee. So even if you've been doing this for a while, but you haven't crossed your T's, dot your I's, it can be for you and it can occur. But if you're someone who doesn't like the ROI of the stress accumulation from taking all these considerations into play, is just not worth it for you. Like it's just gonna make you more stressed out. Then it's not for you. Like focus on something a little bit more realistic or less taxing. One thing I will say is, we mentioned early on, I haven't competed since 2017. So since July of 2017 until like May of this year, when I like officially started, I haven't used MyFitnessPal and tracked my macros to the T at all. Like that app has not seen me in a while. But now I'm back to it because the goal requires a certain level of precision. So you can utilize that tool, but I think the long-term thing is to step away from tracking meticulously. Like if you have a lot of experience under your belt, you should be able to still eat super well. Whereas like if you did track it, or if someone else tracked it for you, you would be really close to like what you would prescribe for yourself anyway, but you're kind of just going with the flow way more and you're not thinking about it as much. I would always still be mindful of like at least protein, like, okay, I need to get between 30 to 60 grams, or obviously having a protein shake here and there, whatever it may be. But I have not used MyFitnessPal or a food scale in quite a while, for years, you know, but that's because you have the experience. So is that what you guys do as well in like certain phases, or are you always tracking?
So right now I've been tracking for a while, but I've actually gotten to the point lately where like I get into my day and by like 4 p.m. I like open my app and nothing's logged, but I've just had the exact same meals. And so like I'm kind of getting to that point where like it's just so automatic that like I don't necessarily need to do the math.
Sure.
But for me, it's never been something that did stress me out. So I never had to like take that break. But I mean, I've been forgetting lately, but I've been doing really good at maintaining. And I think just to touch on that, I think it's really important what we said at the beginning, how we teach our clients to live at maintenance first so that they can do it for the long term. I just really wanted to say that when you were talking through that. But Christina, you go ahead.
Yeah, for me, so I did a contest prep in 2020. So I did a reverse diet and followed it pretty meticulously for the first couple months, maybe 3 or 4. And then eventually just got to the point where I wanted to be a little bit more lenient because I had dieted for pretty much all of 2020. And again, just kind of got to that point where I was very comfortable with intuitively eating. And there were some days where I would, at the end of the day, just kind of plug in everything that I had ate and just kind of ballparked and see where I was. And I was pleasantly surprised always that I was always in a really good range. And now I have actually transitioned back into tracking macros. So yesterday was my first full day. Well, I mean, I plugged in some other stuff prior, but yesterday was like a first full day of tracking. So I'm trying to get back into that because I do have a more specific weight goal that I want to stay within. So I knew that I needed to be a little bit more meticulous with what I was tracking.
Very cool.
Yeah. I think that I think that Marissa is a little bit more intense with tracking than I am. I kind of go, I guess maybe on and off, back and forth between tracking and then taking time off and then getting back into it.
Cool.
Yeah, I did practice for a while. There was a long period in 2017 after my first show, and then in 2019 to 2020 where I was kind of just like ballparking things and just kind of thinking about it. And I was in a summer of 2019, I was in a phase where I was actually playing, like being a hybrid athlete. I was playing a lot of beach volleyball and lifting. And so I was just pounding food at that point, and I was recomping, or at least it felt like I was recomping at that point, because I was just felt like I was getting leaner, I was still getting stronger, and I was fueling my performance at that point. So it kind of happened as like a, I guess, a result that wasn't intended at that point. But yeah, so I have taken those periods. I don't want to like misconstrue and be like I'm a Nazi and I've tracked every day of my life. But for the time being right now, I'm in a really good spot where I've been tracking and I'm pretty consistent with it, because like there's no reason why I can't or don't need to.
Very cool. Very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm so happy with this episode, and I'm really excited for our listeners, especially our female listeners, to take a listen to this. But one of the things that we ask all of our guests at the end of each episode is kind of, what is your best advice, your one piece of advice for living a healthier and sustainable lifestyle?
Man, that's a tough question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hit me with a stumper. I think it depends really on where you're currently at. So that context is going to be key. One thing I will say is, to live a healthier lifestyle, I'm going to say to not be so hard on yourself, where if you get to the gym 3 days per week or you get to the gym 5 days per week, be like okay with that, and don't let your fitness goals be like such an additional stressor from a mental and psychological standpoint. It already is some sort of physical stress on the body, which is absolutely fantastic for you, and the adaptations that are going to come from exercise are amazing. But just be okay with letting things kind of fall into place. Obviously, depending on what your goal is, the level of commitment is going to change. But I think some people get so turned off from this lifestyle because they automatically view it as extreme. They automatically view it as, all in or not in at all. And I think you can take those baby steps to find what's appropriate for you. So if the question was, how can you live a more sustainable, healthy lifestyle? Take a baby step that's going to make your current lifestyle a little bit healthier. For some people, that can be pulling back on all of this mental stress. And then for some people, it can be taking a step forward, saying, okay, I really want to make sure I go to yoga on Saturday morning every weekend. That's how I'm going to start my weekend. You know what I'm saying? Whatever it may be. So yeah, be gracious to yourself and kind of evaluate, do you need more of a push or do you need less stress when it comes to your fitness goals?
I love that. Fitness should add to your life, not add stress to it or take away from it.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Oh, I love that. Okay. Well, Chris, thank you so much for being on today. We really enjoyed your time and your expertise in this field. And guys, we really hope that you enjoyed this episode. And if you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed to the podcast. You can find both of us on Instagram. You can find me at Christina Fit, and Marissa's at Marissa Roy Fitness. And Chris, if they want to find you, what are your handles?
For sure. So on Instagram, it's just my full first name. It's at Christopher.Barakat. And then my website, where my team and I has, free articles, free resources, and then some training programs, as well as coaching services. That's schoolofgains.com, and Gains is spelled with a Z. And I also want to just quickly plug, since we spoke about Recomp the entire time, I do have a nutrition guidebook that's co-authored with Jeff Nippard, and that's called The Ultimate Guide to Body Recomposition. So that kind of just walks you through how to set up your diet, how to adjust your diet for recomposition based on where you're currently at, because context is so important. So whether you're kind of skinny fat, whether you're more advanced, whether you're a novice trainee, we dive into the details there. And I'll throw out a coupon for the Barbell Lifestyle podcast.
Ooh.
Yeah. So I'll make it BLP, if that works for you guys.
That's perfect.
Perfect.
BLP. So yeah, that'll take 15% off for all the listeners here. And yeah, you can find me again at schoolofgains.com or on Instagram. feel free to shoot me a DM or contact me through the site, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Guys
We appreciate it.
No, it's
Absolutely.
my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you guys so much for listening, and we hope to see you back next week.